As the global memory shortage crisis intensifies, local consumers and small businesses in the United States have taken legal action. The world's three largest memory suppliers, Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, have reportedly been hit with a class action lawsuit alleging they manipulated memory prices and restricted global supply. The lawsuit was filed on June 25 in a U.S. federal court in California. The complaint states that these three companies control almost the entire global supply of DRAM, dynamic random access memory. Yet they restricted the supply of legacy DRAM products during a period of massive price increases, further worsening the current memory shortage crisis. Notably, just days earlier, Apple became the latest tech company to raise prices on some of its products due to rising memory chip costs. In addition, multiple smartphone manufacturers have also already raised their prices. The lawsuit details this class action lawsuit was jointly filed by 14 individual consumers and 3 small businesses, including a computer retailer, accusing Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron of violating multiple U.S. antitrust laws. According to the complaint, starting in 2022, due to weak market demand at the time, the 3 companies began colluding to control DRAM supply and pricing. Over the subsequent 4 years, DRAM prices have cumulatively surged by roughly 700%. The plaintiffs add that Apple's recent widespread product price hikes were the catalyst that triggered this lawsuit. The complaint alleges that the 3 companies synchronized capacity cuts and jointly shifted their business focus towards high-bandwidth memory, HBM, while simultaneously phasing out legacy memory products like DDR3 and DDR4. Thereby further squeezing the market supply of traditional DRAM during a period of continuously rising prices. For context, HBM is widely used in AI data centers. Since AI companies are willing to pay exorbitant prices for HBM, this is believed to have prompted memory chip makers to allocate more resources to HBM production rather than traditional DRAM used in ordinary consumer electronics. Earlier this year, Micron announced it would completely shut down its consumer memory brand Crucial, concentrating resources on AI customers instead. Furthermore, the American company recently signed 16 new memory chip supply agreements, all with contract terms extending to 2030. Which also implies that the current tight memory supply situation could persist for an extended period. The plaintiffs argue that in a fully competitive commodity market, when prices surge dramatically, at least one producer usually expands output to capture market share. However, this did not happen, the complaint states. None of the 3 companies took advantage of the other competitors' production cuts to expand capacity and compete for customers. Instead, the 3 companies contracted supply together. The plaintiffs are therefore asking the court to issue an injunction to eliminate the ongoing effects of the defendants' illegal and anti-competitive conduct, and seek treble damages, litigation costs, and attorneys' fees. The complaint also points out that due to extremely high industry barriers to entry, it is virtually impossible for new competitors to rapidly enter the DRAM market. According to the complaint, building a single DRAM fabrication plant costs between $15 billion and $20 billion, and typically takes several years to complete and start production. Moreover, the critical manufacturing processes required to produce high-yield DRAM chips involve decades of accumulated trade secrets. U.S. export controls restrict foreign companies from acquiring advanced generation production equipment, and even if chips are successfully produced, They must undergo a product qualification process lasting 12 to 18 months before entering the supply chain of major customers. The complaint states, the practical result is that when these three companies restrict supply, no outside competitor can rapidly expand capacity to compete with them at lower prices. Currently, the lawsuit remains relatively limited in scale, but if the court accepts the plaintiff's arguments and formally certifies it as a class action, the scope of the case could expand significantly. The antitrust law firm representing the plaintiffs, Bathy Dunn, is seeking to expand the case into a class action covering all ordinary consumers and businesses that purchased products containing DRAM. Not the first time facing similar allegations, the consumer side notes that this is not the first time these three companies have faced legal action for allegedly manipulating the DRAM market. The complaint cites a previous U.S. Department of Justice investigation into DRAM price fixing from 1998 to 2002, noting that Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix each pleaded guilty at the time, paying fines of nearly $300 million and $185 million respectively. Micron, on the other hand, ultimately avoided penalties by proactively reporting the price-fixing cartel to regulators and cooperating with the investigation. Additionally, the complaint references another round of dramatic DRAM price increases between 2016 and 2018 that during that period, related class action lawsuits were also filed in the United States. The plaintiffs point out, the conduct alleged in this case represents the third similar cycle in the same market by the same group of companies. On June 22, 2026, a historic moment occurred in the South Korean capital market. SK Hynix surpassed Samsung Electronics in market capitalization, briefly claiming the top spot in total market value on the Korean Stock Exchange. According to media reports, SK Group Chairman Chey Tae-won stated on June 29 that SK Group plans to build 15 gigawatts (GW) of AI data centers by 2035, positioning them as South Korea's national-level infrastructure and the core foundation for the physical AI era. Chey Tae-won stated that the total investment for this plan will reach a record-breaking 1,000 trillion Korean won, approximately 4.4 trillion renminbi. The fate of SK Hynix, the global memory giant that now holds the lifeline of the AI computing power supply chain, has been a dramatic roller coaster over its 40-plus years. It was born as an abandoned child of a chaebol split, survived the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble burst, debt bankruptcy and restructuring, and many consecutive years of massive losses, repeatedly reaching the brink of life and death in the intense cyclicality of the memory chip industry. How did it persist in R&D during industry troughs, deploy counter-cyclical investments, and ultimately seize the AI era wave with HBM, high bandwidth memory, achieving an epic comeback from the edge of bankruptcy to a global top-tier semiconductor enterprise? What lessons can it offer Chinese companies currently enduring their own cyclical trials? 01 Origin, a product of chaebol games, a chaser in the memory race, 1983 to 2001. The predecessor of SK Hynix was Hyundai Electronics, founded in 1983 by Chung Ji-young, the founder of South Korea's Hyundai Group. In the 1980s, the global DRAM memory chip market was monopolized by Intel and Texas Instruments from the US, and Toshiba and Hitachi from Japan. Samsung Electronics was the first to enter the semiconductor arena, leveraging South Korean government support and chaebol capital to make massive investments in the memory industry. Driven by chaebol rivalry, Chung Ju-young resolved to build Hyundai Group's own semiconductor division, setting up a bipolar rivalry with Samsung. Thus, Hyundai Electronics was born. In its early days, Hyundai Electronics was a classic industry latecomer. At the time, US and Japanese companies held complete systems of patents, equipment, and processes, while the South Korean semiconductor industry practically started from zero. In 1984, Hyundai Electronics built its first wafer fabrication plant in Ikcheon and trial-produced its first 16 kilobits SRAM chip. Yet it faced long-term struggles with low yields, outdated processes, and a shortage of talent, incurring continuous losses for its first 5 years by relying on an all-hands-on-deck approach, high salaries to recruit overseas engineers, and reverse engineering US and Japanese chip architectures. The company independently developed a 256K DRAM in 1987, gradually achieving mass production and profitability, formally joining the ranks of global memory suppliers. The 1997 Asian financial crisis became the first major watershed in Hyundai Electronics' fate. The South Korean economy was severely hit, and the highly leveraged expansion model of the chaebol system became unsustainable. The International Monetary Fund required large South Korean enterprises to slim down and deleverage, promoting an industrial consolidation plan, the infamous Big Deal restructuring in South Korean industrial history. Under government orchestration, Hyundai Electronics acquired LG Semiconductor, then ranked third globally, in 1999, which briefly pushed its DRAM market share to 23.5%, momentarily surpassing Samsung. But this acquisition was a double-edged sword. While merging LG Semiconductor, Hyundai Electronics also took on massive debts, causing its balance sheet to deteriorate sharply, planting the seeds for future crises. In 2000, the global dot-com bubble burst, and PC demand plummeted. DRAM memory chip prices collapsed from $12 to less than $1 within a year, with selling prices far below production costs, plunging the industry into its first deep wintered. To make matters worse, Hyundai Group founder Chung Ju-young passed away in 2001, sparking a succession struggle within the group. His second son, Chung Mong-koo, split off Hyundai Motor. His sixth son, Chung Mong-jun, took over Hyundai Heavy Industries. These core, cash-rich industries successively became independent, leaving only the debt-ridden semiconductor business with no one to back it. To preserve the core framework of the Hyundai Group, management made an agonizing decision: divest the continuously bleeding semiconductor division, completely spin off Hyundai Electronics, rename it Hynix, and place it under the control of a consortium of creditor banks. From that point on, Hynix was officially cut off from the Hyundai Group system, transformed from a chaebol affiliate into an orphan, embarking on a path of self-rescue that would last over a decade. 0 the darkest decade. A life-and-death struggle amid debt quagmire and cyclical cycles. 2001 to 2012. The years 2001 to 2012 marked the most difficult decade in Hynix's history. A period that fully demonstrated the cyclical nature of the memory industry. In its early days after the spin-off, Hynix's total debt reached $14 billion, with a debt-to-asset ratio exceeding 206%. Its cash flow was nearly depleted, to the point that it struggled to even pay employee salaries. Its stock price plunged to 125 Korean won, and it was labeled a junk stock and a bad debt black hole by the capital markets, with South Korea's major chaebols all avoiding it like the plague. the first life-or-death decision, refusing Micron's acquisition, preserving the industrial foundation after the debt crisis erupted. Creditor banks were anxious to liquidate and cut losses. American memory giant Micron Technology opportunistically proposed an acquisition plan, intending to buy all of Hynix's memory business for just over $3 billion, aiming to monopolize the global DRAM market. Just as the deal was almost finalized, Hynix's management, technical team, and labor union formed a rare consensus. If acquired by Micron, decades of accumulated memory process technology, patents, and engineering teams would all drain away, and the domestic semiconductor industry would lose its chance entirely. The board of directors ultimately rejected the acquisition agreement. The labor union even resisted with threats of collective resignation, forcing Micron to abandon the acquisition plan. After refusing the sellout, Hynix embarked on a long debt restructuring process, canceling nearly $8 billion in debt through debt-to-equity swaps, divesting non-core businesses like TFT-LCD panels and power semiconductors, shutting down inefficient production lines, and implementing layoffs to conserve cash, contracting all resources to focus on its core DRAM memory business. Under the leadership of CEO Wu Eui, appointed by the creditor banks, the company established a management direction of survival through slimming down, focusing on memory, and slowly recovering. While repaying debt, it maintained basic R&D investment, struggling to hover around the break-even line. During this phase, the cyclical nature of the memory industry repeatedly manifested. A brief market recovery from 2003 to 2004 saw chip prices rise and Hynix post small profits. The industry declined again from 2006 to 2008, compounded by the global financial crisis, plunging the company back into losses. There was a recovery in 2009, then a rapid descent back into a down cycle in 2011. The memory industry's rhythm of a 3-year cycle, 1 year of boom, 2 years of loss, meant Hynix could never entirely escape the shadow of debt. Most competitors' choices during down cycles were to slash R&D spending, shut down production lines, and wait for the industry to recover. Yet Hynix, amidst its struggles, developed a simple understanding. Memory chips are a heavy asset, long-cycle industry. Expanding production during a boom easily leads to overcapacity, while giving up during a downturn means permanently losing technological advantage. The second redemption, SK Group's counter-cyclical takeover. Chey Tae-won's strategic gamble. In 2012, Hynix was once again on the verge of a funding chain collapse. South Korean chaebols universally regarded it as a bottomless money pit, with no one willing to take it over at this moment. SK Group chairman Chey Tae-won, whose group primarily focused on oil refining, chemicals, and telecommunications, made a decision that shocked the South Korean business world. He spent 3.4 trillion Korean won to acquire a controlling stake in Hynix through a private placement, bringing it into the SK system and renaming it SK Hynix. This acquisition was highly controversial at the time. SK Group's main businesses were energy and telecommunications, which provided stable cash flow, and it had no semiconductor manufacturing experience whatsoever. 90% of the board's senior executives voted against the deal, and rating agency S&P consequently downgraded SK Telecom's credit rating, citing the extreme cyclicality of the semiconductor industry and warning that sustained capital expenditure would drag down the group's overall profitability. But Chey Tae-won possessed an underlying judgment that transcended the cycle. If oil was the blood of the industrial age, then data is the blood of the digital age. Memory chips, which carry global data flows, are the infrastructure of the future digital economy, with irreplaceable long-term value. After the acquisition, SK Group injected stable cash flow into SK Hynix, took over its remaining debts, and simultaneously laid down two ironclad rules. First, do not pursue short-term profit performance in financial reports, allowing the company to sustain temporary losses during industry downturns. Second, R&D investment must not be drastically cut along with cyclical fluctuations, and the pace of technological iteration must be maintained. From that point on, SK Hynix ended a decade of drifting and entered a new development phase. But even greater tests were just beginning. 03 Strategic patience, counter-cyclical gambling, and a decade-long bet on the HBM track. 2012 to 2022. After SK Group took over in 2012, SK Hynix entered a period of strategic patience. This decade involved two crucial strategic gambles by management, determining whether the company could subsequently overtake competitors on the curve. The first gamble, counter-cyclical capacity investment, building moats using industry consolidation. The classic cyclical logic of the memory industry is demand rises, prices increase, industry-wide capacity expansion, overcapacity, price collapse, losses, and production cuts, supply contraction, a new recovery. The business strategy of the vast majority of enterprises is to chase rising prices and flee falling ones, building factories aggressively during good times and cutting capacity and slashing R&D during bad times. Under Chey Tae-won's leadership, SK Hynix adopted a completely opposite, counter-cyclical investment strategy during industry boom peaks. Moderately control capital expenditure to avoid excessive capacity expansion that triggers price wars. During industry recession troughs, continuously build new wafer fabs, upgrade equipment, and expand capacity, using the window when equipment procurement costs fall and engineering talent becomes mobile to solidify manufacturing capabilities. During two down cycles in the memory industry between 2015 and 2019, Samsung and Micron successively delayed their fab construction plans and reduced equipment purchases. That SK Hynix, however, continued to expand wafer production lines in Ikkeon and Cheongju, South Korea, while simultaneously establishing packaging bases in Wuxi and Chongqing, China. Although it suffered consecutive years of losses, with cumulative losses once reaching 7 trillion Korean won, when the industry recovered, SK Hynix, with its ample capacity, quickly seized market share, while competitors that had reduced investment faced capacity shortages and outdated processes. This counter-cyclical operation of expanding when others are fearful is essentially the survival of the fittest rule in heavy asset manufacturing. Down cycles eliminate small and medium-sized enterprises that lack funds and conviction. Those who endure the winter will reap the majority of market share after the recovery. The second gamble, betting the farm on the niche HBM track amid universal doubt. In 2013, SK Hynix developed the world's first HBM, high-bandwidth memory, chip. At that time, cloud computing was not yet widespread, and AI large language models were completely unforeseen. HBM was only used in small quantities in high-end graphics cards and supercomputers. The market space was tiny, manufacturing costs were exorbitant, and orders were scarce. The industry universally dismissed HBM as a niche and unpromising track, high investment with a long payback period, not worth deploying at scale. Between 2015 and 2020, Samsung and Micron successively cut HBM R&D budgets, retaining only small-scale experimental lines to concentrate resources on producing more profitable general-purpose DRAM and NAND flash memory. Despite the internal finance department repeatedly submitting reports warning that the short-term HBM market size is less than $10 billion, with an 8 to 10-year payback period. Chey Tae-won and SK Hynix's management made another decision against industry consensus. They channeled 70% of R&D funds and 60% of new wafer capacity into HBM technology. Iteration, persistently investing hundreds of billions of Korean won annually in R&D, even if general DRAM business profits were diluted and financial reports faced long-term pressure. They never interrupted the process refinement for HBM. Management's judgment was this: the traditional von Neumann architecture has a memory wall bottleneck as demand for computing power increases. Data transfer bandwidth will become the core limitation restricting computational efficiency, and stacked HBM is the only solution. Although there was no demand at the time, once general artificial intelligence and large-scale cloud computing exploded, high-speed memory would become a rigid demand for computing chips. Over the following decade, SK Hynix continuously iterated through 5 generations of products from HBM1 to HBM3E, independently developed MRMUF, mass reflow molded underfill, mass reflow packaging technology, and overcame a series of technical challenges, including ultra-thin wafer stacking, thermal dissipation control, and yield improvement. Quietly building a 3-in-1 mode of patents, processes, and mass production capabilities. During this period of patience, SK Hynix also completed another crucial strategic move. In 2020, it spent $9 billion in 2 phases to acquire Intel's NAND flash and SSD business, establishing the high-end enterprise storage brand Solidigm. This filled its NAND flash gap, forming a complete portfolio of 3 major product lines: DRAM, HBM, and NAND, transforming the company from a pure-play memory manufacturer into a comprehensive storage solutions provider. In November 2022, ChatGPT burst onto the scene, and global demand for AI computing power exploded instantaneously. The demand for high-bandwidth memory for GPUs grew exponentially. The market suddenly discovered that there were very few manufacturers capable of mass-producing mature HBM3E chips. At SK Hynix, having deep cultivated this track for a decade, had already seized the first-mover advantage. The technological reserves accumulated over 10 years of patience had met their moment of full monetization. 0 for the present. Cycle restructuring and performance explosion amid the AI wave. 2023 to 2026. From cyclical losses to super boom. A rollercoaster performance reversal in 2023. Global consumer electronics demand was weak. General DRAM and NAND prices fell sharply, and the memory industry once again entered a deep winter. SK Hynix posted a full-year loss of 9.1 trillion Korean won, with operating pressure returning to elevated levels. But just as competitors were contracting across the board, AI computing power demand began rapidly offsetting the decline in consumer demand, with HBM orders continuously surging. From 2024 onwards, the industry landscape completely reversed. Tech giants like NVIDIA, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon began massive procurement of AI servers, the HBM chips were in severe short supply, leading to an epic reversal in SK Hynix's performance. The net profit reached 19.8 trillion Korean won in 2024, then skyrocketed to 42.95 trillion Korean won in 2025. In the first quarter of 2026 alone, quarterly operating profit hit 37.6 trillion Korean won, with an operating profit margin as high as 72%, surpassing even TSMC in profitability and topping the global semiconductor profit rankings. The surge in performance drove a market capitalization frenzy, with SK Hynix's stock price rising over 500% in 2 years. In June 2026, its common stock market cap briefly surpassed Samsung Electronics, setting a new record in the South Korean capital market. As of mid-2026, SK Hynix's global market position is as follows. General DRAM memory, ranked second globally with a 29% market share, behind only Samsung at 38%. NAND flash memory, ranked second globally with an 18% market share, focusing on enterprise SSDs through its Solidigm brand. HBM high bandwidth memory, ranked first globally with a 58% market share, deeply tied to NVIDIA, commanding half of the high-end AI memory market. The once bankrupt, abandoned child has vaulted to become a core choke point player in the global AI computing power supply chain, controlling the indispensable hardware resources for training large AI models. The essence of this boom: coexisting cyclical weakening and structural dividends. Many people simply attribute SK Hynix's explosion to catching the AI wave. But the deeper logic is a structural change in the operating rules of the memory industry. First, traditional memory demand comes from smartphones, PCs, and consumer electronics. A stock-based cyclical demand. HBM, on the other hand, targets AI computing infrastructure, representing a secular incremental demand that ensures supply chain stability. Cloud service providers have begun signing long-term agreements, 2 to 5 years, with memory manufacturers, locking in volume and price, which significantly smooths out price volatility and weakens the original cyclical fluctuation amplitude. Second, the process barriers for HBM are extremely high, and new production line construction cycles take 2 to 3 years, making rapid short-term capacity expansion difficult. The supply-demand gap persists long-term, forming a temporary oligopoly. However, cyclicality has not completely disappeared. In the second quarter of 2026, SK Hynix has already proactively slowed the pace of HBM4 capacity expansion, redirecting some capacity back to general DRAM, anticipating that after global HBM capacity is released in a concentrated manner around 2028, a new round of cyclical adjustment may arrive. The company is preemptively balancing its production capacity to mitigate the risk of a downturn after the peak of the current boom cycle. 05 Outlook. From memory manufacturer to AI infrastructure service provider, considering industry trends, technological roadmaps, and strategic planning, SK Hynix's future development can be divided into 3 phases: short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Short-term, 2026, 2027. This is a dividend harvesting period, consolidating the HBM leadership position. The next 2 years are the peak of global AI computing power construction. The HBM supply-demand gap will remain high, and SK Hynix will enter a golden period. On one hand, it will mass-produce HBM4 and HBM4E products in conjunction with NVIDIA's next-generation AI architectures, maintaining an over 55% share of the high-end HBM market. On the other hand, it will launch a NASDAQ listing to raise approximately $29.4 billion for global capacity expansion, building a dedicated HBM fab in Yongin, South Korea, and an advanced packaging facility in Indiana, USA, to diversify geopolitical risks. At the same time, it will deepen collaboration with TSMC in advanced nodes, base die foundry, and CoWES packaging to refine its global supply chain footprint. A medium term, 2028. 2030 technology iteration and cultivation of the second growth curve. As the AI training market gradually matures, the industry's center of gravity will shift to inference computing, edge computing, and cold data storage. SK Hynix's strategic focus will shift from simply selling HBM chips to three major upgrades: technology iteration, develop HBM5, 3D DRAM, and AI DRAM processing and memory chips to break through the memory wall bottleneck and enter the new track of compute memory integration. Product structure: expand Solidigm's enterprise SSD business, increase global NAND flash market share to 25%, forming a balanced development structure across DRAM, HBM, and NAND to reduce single product dependency. Business model: transform from a chip supplier to an integrated AI memory solution service provider, offering cloud vendors and AI enterprises integrated computing memory design solutions to increase customer stickiness and added value. Long-term, 2030 and beyond, reconstruct computing architecture and participate in the next generation of general intelligence industry. In the long run, SK Hynix aims to move beyond the traditional memory track and participate in the restructuring of computing architecture in the post-Moore era. The company has already preemptively deployed next-generation memory media like MRAM and ReRAM, delving deeply into processing and memory technology, attempting to change the traditional architecture where computing and storage are separated, upgrading from a midstream component manufacturer in the supply chain to a rule builder for the next-generation computing system. At the same time, the company must confront three major long-term risk constraints. First, Samsung's continued catch-up in the HBM field, which, upon yield improvement, will divert high-end orders. Second, the potential for a cyclical downturn to return if AI capital expenditure contracts. Third, intensifying global geopolitical tech rivalry, with export controls and supply chain restrictions impacting global capacity deployment. 06 The management lessons from SK Hynix. Reviewing SK Hynix's 40-plus years of rise and fall, its comeback is not an accidental stroke of luck or a windfall, but a practical template of strategic thinking, governance models, and business philosophy. It offers the following lessons for heavy asset tech enterprises, manufacturing managers, and China's semiconductor industry. Lesson 1: heavy asset cyclical industries. The greatest enemy is short-termism. Memory chips are a classic, strongly cyclical, high investment, long payback industry. Financial statements often only reflect short-term profits and losses, unable to measure the long-term value of technological accumulation, process barriers, and capacity reserves. Most enterprise managers easily fall into the trap of quarterly performance orientation, blindly expanding during booms, slashing R&D and shrinking investment during busts, chasing highs and fleeing lows alongside market sentiment. ultimately getting repeatedly wounded through the cyclical turns that SK Hynix's experience proves. The winning strategy in a cyclical industry is not predicting short-term price rises and falls, but establishing a management framework that spans cycles, using long-term strategy to constrain short-term financial impulses. Companies need to differentiate between cyclical losses and operational losses. During systemic industry downturns, it is preferable to endure temporary profit declines rather than sacrifice the foundation of R&D and talent, avoiding the erosion of long-term competitiveness due to short-term financial report pressures. This logic applies equally to other heavy asset tracks like semiconductors, new energy, and high-end manufacturing. Lesson 02: Strategic resolve comes from judgments of underlying trends, not from market consensus. In the business world, the vast majority of opportunities are born in the blind spots of industry consensus. From 2013 to 2020, HBM was dismissed by the entire industry as a niche track, a non-consensus direction. At the time, SK Hynix's courage to bet against the trend fundamentally stemmed from management looking beyond immediate market demand and anticipating the underlying trends of the digital economy and the computing power era. A classic proposition in management science asks, do excellent managers follow cycles or create cycles? The answer SK Hynix provides is, align with megatrends, but go against minor cycles. Do not chase dividends based on short-term market fads. Instead, make long-term deployments based on the underlying logic of the industry. Many companies habitually cluster into mature tracks to wage price wars while ignoring technological directions that are currently unpopular but will be rigid demands in the future. By the time the windfall arrives, and they scramble to catch up, they have already lost their first-mover advantage. Lesson 03: Challenger enterprises are suited to adopt a blue ocean strategy of differentiated competition. As the memory industry leader, Samsung possesses full industry chain advantages with its business, covering logic chips, memory, foundry, and end-user smartphones. Its resources dispersed across dozens of tracks. As a latecomer, SK Hynix clearly understood it would be difficult to comprehensively surpass Samsung head-on in the general DRAM track. Therefore, it opted for differentiated competition, avoiding the red ocean of intense rivalry, and focused on the niche, high-barrier HBM segment, achieving a curve overtaking through a single-point breakthrough. This case confirms the challenger's strategy. Industry leaders often suffer from weaknesses like resource dispersion, conservative decision-making, and path dependency. Late-moving enterprises need not fight giants head-on in mature markets. Rather, they should seek out pain points in the industry chain and future essential niche segments, concentrating all resources to build a single-point moat. This approach makes a successful counterattack more achievable. Lesson 4: Moments of life or death survival for an enterprise. A survivor's mindset is superior to a profit mindset. In the darkest moments on the brink of bankruptcy, SK Hynix did not choose to sell off its core technology or drastically downsize to generate short-term cash flow. Instead, it insisted on preserving its process engineering teams, production line equipment, and patent portfolio, prioritizing survival over profit. For high-tech manufacturing companies, the engineering team, process know-how, and production line tuning experience are assets far more precious than book cash. Once core talent is lost and production lines are shuttered, even if funding becomes available later, it is extremely difficult to rebuild competitiveness. The lesson for crisis management is this. When a company faces a systemic industry winter, the primary goal is not to swing back to profitability, but to preserve core capabilities. Become one of the survivors of the cycle and wait for the window of recovery to open. Lesson 05. The entrepreneur's long-term vision determines the enterprise's growth ceiling. Point 2. Pivotal decisions for SK Hynix. Chey Tae-won's contrarian acquisition of the debt-laden Hynix and his insistence, against unanimous internal opposition, on betting on HBM for a decade. Both stem from an entrepreneurial vision that transcends what financial reports can show in modern corporate governance. Boards of directors and finance departments often lean towards risk aversion and short-term gains. Entrepreneurs must shoulder the responsibility of trend judgment, striking a balance between short-term interests and long-term value. True entrepreneurship is not about maximizing revenue during good times, but about being able to steadfastly uphold the long-term value of an industry when everyone else is pessimistic, and being willing to make cross-cyclical investments for the future. What China's semiconductor industry can learn. And beware of China's memory industry is currently in a catch-up phase. The development environments of CXMT, DRAM, and YMTC, NAND, closely resemble that of SK Hynix a decade ago. The Hynix case offers both applicable experience and cautionary lessons that learn from experiences that domestic companies can adopt. 01. Persist in counter-cyclical R&D investment. Do not arbitrarily adjust R&D budgets based on the rise and fall of chip prices. The catch-up cycle in the memory industry is long, requiring continuous process iteration. Do not cut investment during industry downturns, thus missing the catch-up window. 02. Deploy in differentiated tracks. Avoid across-the-board infighting with overseas giants in the general-purpose memory market. Preemptively develop advanced packaging, memory interface chips, enterprise SSDs, automotive-grade memory, processing in memory, and other niche segments to build differentiated advantages. 03. Construct a long-term capital support system. The semiconductor industry needs long-term capital that can withstand cross-cyclical losses. Avoiding frequent interference in corporate operational rhythm by short-term capital. 04. Emphasize process accumulation and the development of engineering talent systems. That know-how is the core barrier in memory manufacturing and requires long-term sedimentation and refinement. Beware of aspects requiring vigilance. 01. Recognize the cyclical patterns. Do not blindly expand capacity on a massive scale during industry booms to prevent future overcapacity from triggering price wars. Repeating the cyclical expansion mistakes of overseas manufacturers. 02. High-end technology iteration must proceed step by step. High-end memory like HBM is not just about wafer fabrication capability, but a comprehensive engineering endeavor involving packaging, materials, thermal dissipation, and system integration. One must not rush for quick results. Multi-link coordinated accumulation is necessary. 03. Balance global deployment with supply chain security. One must both rely on the global market to absorb capacity and build a self-controllable equipment and materials supporting system to hedge against external constraints imposed by geopolitical policies. Epilogue. SK Hynix's 4 decades are a cyclical epic of the memory industry, and even more so, a business lesson on long-termism. Its journey from a chaebol's abandoned child to a core giant in the AI era is not a myth of overnight success or catching a windfall, but the result of enduring too. economic crises, and 3 industry cycles, holding fast to technology in the darkest hours, and laying out plans for the future beyond consensus. A payoff earned through a dozen years of quiet persistence in a business environment rife with short-termism and the chase for immediate dividends. SK Hynix's journey tells us, all the gifts of an era originate from silent, protracted cultivation. All the enduring success that spans cycles rests upon restraint, conviction, and a steadfast commitment to long-term value. For Chinese enterprises and managers currently navigating the trials of the cycle, only by understanding cycles, revering the laws of the market, and basing actions on a long-term perspective can one navigate steadily and far through the tides of the times.